And can you guys see this Back to Europe page?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good. Um, what we I wanted to before getting to this, there's a couple things I want to cover tonight. And first is I really appreciate you guys being the stalwarts coming here every time we meet. I really appreciate that. I know these things are recorded so everybody can watch them and everything, but it is nice having human interaction occasionally. A couple things I wanted to do before we wind up, and I want to make sure we get it covered, is I want to talk about what the final is. And I want to look at a couple of the AI assignments again, see if there's any new ones, but also just introduce people to some of the projects. And I would really recommend going over the discovery, the discussion, the discussions where people share their AI stuff and share their projects too, just to get some ideas. And I did have somebody did do a project where they designed it to cover a lot of the same information that didn't involve AI, and that was just fine. There's a little bit of a grading problem because they didn't introduce it, they didn't say what they were doing, and so I thought they just weren't following the directions, but we got that taken care of. It's always really interesting to me to see what people end up doing and how far they push it, and I enjoy not really giving a lot of direction on this because I find that you guys always do more than what I'm expecting. Well, almost always, pretty much most of the time. And I really appreciate that. So I want to stop. I want to stop in about an hour or so we can go over that stuff before we wind everything up. And before we do that, I did want to talk about the final, and then I want to talk about the final again before we wrap up. The final, let's see, I'm going to show this to you guys. Give me just a second here. I've this morning I teach a class as well, and as I was talking about it, um, I got an email this afternoon where somebody was asking about the final because they were freaking out about not being able to study for it. The finals that I give for most of the classes that I do, it's impossible to study for, and it's not because the test is so tricky. It's because I don't do a typical final. So I am trying to get to this really quick here. Have any of you taken a class from me before?
I have not.
Okay. I do the same thing for every class that I teach at Utah Tech. So we go to the final capstone project module. This is where uh, it's all the stuff for that final capstone project you've been working on, and then also the extra credit stuff that I wanted to make sure everybody knew about. Somebody did turn this in to just today and made me cry tears of real joy, and I'll explain that. But the in-class online final, you notice that it's not published. I will not publish it until Sunday night at midnight, and it will be open Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday for you guys to work on. And what this essentially is, and I will have to change the wording. It tells what time we met last year when I was doing this in person. This is not going to be in person. You're just going to write these things up. And the way that you do this and get full credit is you're sharing your experience with me. And it is going to be a total of 300 words that you're going to be writing. These words, and I want to be completely clear because I actually had somebody challenge me on this. The words are for your answers. Notice it says, what was the greatest challenge in this course? And I say at least 75 words. That's for the answer. And just to be clear, that does not mean copying this, putting it into a document, writing your answer after this, and counting the words of the question as those 75 words. That does not count. It's an answer. Each answer needs to be at least 75 words. All right. So you have a total of 300 words altogether. Does everybody understand that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. The only reason why I feel I need to say that is because last year somebody, like I said, somebody challenged me on it. It's 75 words per answer. And these four questions are: what was your greatest challenge? What was your greatest success? What was the greatest surprise? And this could be where you spend 75 words talking about you had no idea that people in different part of the world managed to connect somehow. And then we learned about Viking burials where the family would be like the wife would be burned on the burial vessel. We learned about that from Muslim writers and not from Vikings. It could be something like that, or it could be that you'd never learned or you'd never heard before about the Yoruba and their photorealistic bronze castings. Anything like it doesn't matter. What it is just 75 words about the biggest surprise module, anything you found, whatever. And then the last question is, what is one principle that you will take from this course and use in your future career as an artist? If you're not an artist, doesn't matter your future career. So as whatever it is. Do you guys remember why I refer to everybody as artists? Do you remember what we talked about in the very first day that we met?
Because we have our own stories to tell.
Well, I talked about how art is the action or the evidence of the action whenever you create working with something that is beyond your immediate ego-driven self. So anytime you do anything where you get into the zone, and it could be anything. You could be slinging fries at McDonald's, or you could be washing windmills. It does not. It honestly does not matter. Everybody is an artist, and that's one of the reasons why I put that there. Anyways, so this is the final. It'll be open Sunday night at midnight. It'll be online and the last moment you can turn stuff in is Friday at midnight next week. So you have all week. The reason I do that is because if, Lindsay, you turn it in and you got the first three questions, but you completely spaced the fourth question, you turn that in Monday, I'll grade it, let you know what's missing, and then you can turn around and resubmit it after you fix it. So it behooves everybody to get this turned in as soon as possible during the week. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Definitely.
Okay. And whether or not it makes sense, that's the way we're doing it. Okay, so those are the four questions. Like I said, I will publish it on Sunday at midnight. And you'll have 5 full days to do it. Oh, and the extra credit thing I mentioned, that assignment is open now in this last module. So if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, final and final capstone project, right here you see extra credit weekly reflection. Get 25 points of extra credit. The person who did this, the first person who did it, actually watched the movie Hero with Jet Li and wrote a full standard weekly reflection on the movie. It did a great job. And I was crying when I was reading it because that is one of my favorite action movies ever.
Remember you mentioning that before of heavily pointing to that movie for people to do projects on.
Well, it is one of the most beautiful examples of Chinese produced cinema in the last 30 years, I think. It is exceptional. Another one is Fearless, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Of course, those are both really, really nice. And then the Detective D movies are a lot of fun too. But the reason why I like those for this class is because, except for Fearless, the others fit within the scope of the class. So, if you're going to be doing a movie or whatever, make sure that the movie ties in something about the class. And I almost, if you want to do write one about the Immortals, the Marvel movie Immortals, make sure that you talk about how Kit Harrington is what's her Circe's boyfriend, and he works in the antiques wing at the London Museum. Because then it will tie into the class. Does everybody get that?
Think so.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
It's just like associating it to the aspects of class that we have learned and not like
Right.
something more contemporary.
Yeah, just bring it back to the class somehow. If you guys want to do Godzilla or any of the Toho monsters movies, that's fine. Toho Studios or Blue Eye Samurai. Both those things give you a pass, and they tie directly into the class because I said so. But if you're going to be doing a movie like on John Wick, you could do that, but you've got to make sure that it's John Wick 2, because in that there's a shootout that happens inside the Metropolitan Art Museum, and he's shooting up all those classical Roman and Greek statues. You understand? So you just got to mention that somehow
Yeah,
in your reflection. What's that?
I was just agreeing.
Okay. All right. Okay, so we have gone all over the world pretty much. The last couple of weeks, I'm sorry, my computer conked out, so we weren't able to talk about Oceania and Mississippians culture too much. But we kept hovering around Europe. We went to Africa and India. We went to the Middle East, um, uh, the Pacific Ocean, and Japan. We've gone all around the place. And since this class ends with Gothicism, I wanted to go back to that. And we're going to just go through this stuff. I want to talk about all this stuff that we look at in terms of what you have learned about the different movements, or art periods rather, that seem to have impacted these things that we're looking at. And the elements that we're going to be looking at is where Gothicism comes from, Gothic architecture and Gothic arts, primarily. And these videos, I used to watch them in the class, but I'm finding out that I'm getting dinged because I don't reference them correctly, or a lot of people that produce these kinds of things see that I have they have bots that will find out about it. And so we aren't going to watch these videos necessarily. I'm thinking I may show you clips from them, but I really want you guys to watch these videos as much as you can. We're going to look at some of the architecture, and we're going to look at some of the arts like sculpture and stuff like that. What events happened in the world that led up to 1300, 1350, this time period that we're talking about? Particularly events that happened around the Mediterranean that impacted Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. Of course, the time that we are talking about is roughly 1200 to 1500. And Gothicism was at high swing right before the Renaissance, and it leads us right up to the year 1350. And that's where it takes off into the next class, 2720. This time period overlapped the Crusades. The Crusades happened between 1096 and about 1395, right around there. So what is that, 300 years, something like that? And at the time, that represents anywhere from 8 to 12 generations. In a lot of parts of Europe, if you live past 35, you were an ancient man. You're an old man. Kids would get married in their tweens, 12, 13, 14. And for contractual obligations, marriages would happen as soon as a baby was born in some cases. Sometimes the parent the people that got married wouldn't meet for another 10 or 12 years. But we're talking about a period of time in the world that is much different than now. Does anybody want to hazard a guess what the age of consent is on the federal level in this country right now?
16.
It's actually 12.
Oh,
Because
Yeah.
everyone's dead at 20.
What's that?
Because everyone's dead at 20.
Well, I'm talking about today.
Oh,
Today, the average age of the federal age of consent is 12. And one of the reasons why they do that is that every state can do their own thing. In New York in the 1860s, age of consent was 10. Throughout the 1800s, age of consent was 10. And people could be functioning adults. While today we're still thinking of them, being in 6th grade, and which blows me away. Elementary school kids being adults. But like what Zach is saying, if we go back 1,000 years, go back to this time, yeah, people got old fast, people died fast, people grew up fast. And so we're talking about a very different perspective on the world. And I can kind of see people were smaller too. Malnutrition was a lot more common than it is today in the areas that felt like they were governing the world. You had water was not really healthy, but even though this is comfortable on a level where we can kind of.
What can you get for the price of a pizza delivery, a phone case, or even your shampoo? ZWCAD Flex, flexible power.
Okay, here we go. Okay, I'm not going to show this, but I do want to show parts of it. I think the whole point that I'm trying to make is this happened in a much different time period, but because we see these images a lot, we think we understand what's going on. And I just want to impress on people's minds that we recognize a lot of stuff, but it's not exactly the way we think it is. A lot of things were changed specifically to make it easier and more palatable for movie audiences, primarily, and to simplify teaching. Now, we did talk. I wanted people to watch this because this kind of covers a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about in this part of the world, where you have. Remember, the Crusades happened from about 1096 up to about 1395, right around there. So we got both Romanesque and Gothic. And if we go over and talk about some of these things, we looked at some of this stuff in the early Christian plaques that we saw, the Carolingian art that we saw. A lot of this kind of stuff deals with the Merovingian and Carolingian art that we were looking at. But also this time period, this is where people were interacting heavily with the new seat of Rome, which was in Turkey. And we talked a lot about the overlaps, the Vikings, the Muslims, the people in India and the Europeans all, were interacting quite a bit. Byzantine, this has to do with greater areas of moving populations around the Mediterranean, North Africa, Eastern Europe. The Byzantine specifically is that site area that is targeted, with the center being in Constantinople, in Turkey. And then Romanesque is where people are starting to turn back to this kind of stuff, the Italian Roman stuff, and bringing it forward into their time period. This covers the time period leading up to the beginning of the Crusades and the first couple Crusades. And then this is where the Romanesque stuff starts getting its own kind of distinctly European flavor, We'll talk about that a little bit. And I think that a lot of the times this represents more of a European identity. Do you remember who the guy is that kind of brought Europe together so that it had its own identity in the same way that Emperor Qin brought the Seven Kingdoms together in China?
It was Charlemagne, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the Gothic, this is where people were kind of given their own European spin with the things that they learned after the Crusades and stuff, coming back from the Middle East and North Africa. And I think that they're giving their spin onto the Romanesque, which is essentially just updating Roman architecture into, at the time, contemporary Europe. And I think that that's what the biggest difference is between these two groups. So this video does talk about quite a bit of that. Remember the early Christian art? We saw some of that with the plaques and everything. This is the migration art, people moving around. This is where you find stuff in Viking burials that looks like it was heavily influenced or informed by Islamic design, or stuff from India, or stuff from other parts of the world. Really interesting stuff. And the Byzantine, everybody remembers these figures. Very tall, big eyes. And the Romanesque stuff is, even though you look at this and it looks very much like it has the same kind of level of complexity that we saw with some of the Charlemagne stuff, they are trying to do some things that tie it with the Romans. And even though this figure does not look as realistic as Roman sculpture, what's interesting about it is that it's seated with implements that are designed to remind you of Rome. And that's one of the reasons why it fits in with the Romanesque idea. And honestly, we did not talk about that directly quite a bit. Now, if we look at this is Gothic architecture. Remember, we some of the stuff we talked about, the Charlemagne, the Carolingian stuff. You have the 3-point equilateral triangle. You also have the two towers. You have elements like these arches that are very Roman. But what separates this out is that it uses some of the Roman type stuff, but it doesn't have the two towers like a lot of the Charlemagne stuff did. And it uses a little bit of different technology. It's starting to bring in some of those battlement ideas. Like here's I don't know if you guys can see this right here. Remember in the Crusader castles, we saw those areas where people would, the crenellations that people would shoot through. And you see that in a lot of the Gothic style churches and things that are built up, where typically churches don't have crenellations for people to shoot out of. So I definitely check this out. I want to bring that down. There are a lot of things that are happening at this time. We're moving into the world where the Renaissance is going to happen. People have been going through the Crusades for generations, where they are learning an entirely different perspectives on the world. I'm going to ask a trick question right now. When do you think people started realizing that the world was round instead of flat? And if you guys don't want to answer it because you'll think I'll embarrass you, you're probably right.
Even the ancient Greeks knew.
You are right, Lindsay. You are absolutely right. About 2,000 years ago, there was a Greek mathematician that was able to calculate the circumference of the planet with greater accuracy than contemporary satellite technology.
Isn't it like using obelisks in like different cities in Egypt and then paying someone to measure how long that distance was? Or am I thinking of a different person?
No, you're thinking of the same thing. It was actually guard towers. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And obelisk, somebody did check his work with obelisk too. You're right on that as well. And but they were just using math. People were smart. Vikings were kind of like the Atlantic Ocean version of the Islander sailors that we learned about a couple weeks ago, because the Vikings could do all sorts of stuff too, because they knew that the world was round. They knew how things worked. Anybody that walked any great distance knew that the world was round, but it was for people that safeguarded the information, with all this stuff happening after the Crusades and everything, that's when people started to give themselves more and more permission to think for themselves. And for free thinkers, it can be a really dangerous place. But definitely watch these as well. Let's see. We're not going to watch this. This guy talks about Gothic art. I like this because it kind of shows you a map of the world that we're looking at. Remember that this whole area right through here was the Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne. And, it shows just right there, it kind of collapsed a little bit, but he was the one that kind of made everybody think of themselves as Europeans anyway. And this gives an idea of where in the world this is going on. We do have Gothic stuff showing up in England, Spain, and a lot of other places. Basically, every country that sent soldiers on the Crusades, when they came back, that's where you start seeing Gothicism showing up. And this is one of the big differences. Again, it's not always different. And we'll look at that when we look at some of the architecture. This is very much a Roman style arch, and this is very much a Gothic style arch. And the big difference is that the Gothic style arches, something like this starts showing up like a little bit of a predecessor during Charlemagne with that 3-point triangle. But one of the reasons why these start showing up is to remind people it isn't always a perfect 3-point triangle that they use, but it happens often enough that when you see something like this, it's kind of become a subliminal reminder of the Trinity. And to make a lot of these Gothic arches, now this is a little bit narrower one, but one of the standard ones is you put your compass on one point and widen your compass out until it was the width of the archway, and you bring the compass up and you get one side of the arc, switch points, get the other side of the arc. Now this is a little bit taller than that. That the perfect 3-point arch would come right up to about right here, but that is what a lot of these arches are based on, that idea of the 3-point arch to remind people of the Trinity. So just an interesting aside. So definitely watch this video. And this shows you a really good, solid difference too. The Romans liked using circles and variations of the circles. These are called barrel arches because they're designed almost like two pipes intersecting. And with Gothic architecture, as they are using, they came back seeing a lot of the peaked arches in the Middle East and North Africa, and they were working with a lot of math ideas that they hadn't really thought about seriously before then. So this is kind of all bubbling in the background. And one of the things they realized is with these kind of Roman type archways, you have a lot of weight built up in these pipes that are being used to support the building above them. And Gothic architects started realizing that you could do something similar with ribbed vaults that meant a peak in the middle. And that way, all that weight would be on that rib, and that rib would push against the opposite rib. And you would be able to create something that bore a very similar amount of weight with about a quarter of the weight of material. Are you guys seeing that?
Yeah.
And that allowed people to start building taller and taller buildings. And this, I think, side by side, this really gives you a good idea of what those differences are. Using Roman style architecture, being aware of those barrel vaults and the barrel archways, you can get pretty high. And in order to get higher than this, then you'd need to bring in the Byzantine type of architecture, the Carolingian type stuff where you have the central dome and then the cascading buildings off of that to kind of carry the weight. But being mindful of those kind of peaked arches and using the ribs instead of the barrel vaults like this, people were able to build taller and taller buildings with less weight of material, because that higher weight, instead of building those cascading structures like we saw in the Byzantine architecture, you would carry that weight off using the ribs. And this is where we get an idea called flying buttress. And we'll look at those. This is what a flying buttress is. I think, and this is just anecdotal, I think after the Crusades, people had seen the Hagia Sophia, which was the biggest building in the universe at the time. Well, on the earth, I guess. And that wasn't a pyramid. It was a building you could actually go inside. And if you can imagine, if we're setting this up next to the Hagia Sophia, on our right would be that central dome. Just off of this would be those piers that supported that dome. And then this area, the parallel would be all those smaller domes and smaller buildings that kind of supported the weight of those piers. And with the Gothic stuff, what they did was took away all those other buildings, and they used these ribs, and these structures to push the weight out instead of building whole buildings. So you don't have the piers, you have towers. Instead of the structuring buildings, you have these ribs going out, and these are actually called flying buttresses, which I know you've heard that term before. And one of the big reasons they would do this is glass technology was really picking up in Europe. They'd seen all these amazing things over in the Middle East, came back, oh man, I want to do that too. And by designing buildings using ribs to carry the weight, and to use rib structures to distribute the weight instead of having supporting buildings next to it, you could create structures that had walls with huge spaces for windows, for glass. And I don't know if you guys have been to churches like this. It is absolutely astounding. Now, if we look at these stained glass windows, you can see this diamond that I'm tracing with my mouse right here is about 2 feet by 2 feet. So the individual windows themselves were not very big, maybe 4 to 6 square feet total for each one. But by using the ribbing to support the weight and make those structures, then you could make this whole wall look like it's made out of nothing but glass. Can everybody see that?
Yes, that's a really cool photo.
So special thanks to this guy, the Art History 101 guy. I love the pictures that he's doing. So, and this one talks about common characteristics, and we'll look at those a little bit more too. But I want to share this with you. Let's see. Again, we're not going to watch the video. Now, I look at this stuff, and I think a lot of the times I think Carolingian, but then you start looking at this, and some of these things that remind me about what we saw in India. All the fancy lacy type stuff going on. But what we are seeing is Romanesque right here. Remember, it's the round arches, and then that going into Gothic type stuff with the fancy schmancy stuff that starts looking like lace on the walls. When you see ribs like this, they're heavily inspired by Gothic work. If it was Romanesque, these would be solid. Definitely check this out. This guy, he does not have a thing against Tim Burton or The Corpse Bride. He just used that to illustrate something. And then this is another good example of those windows. If we look at the windows here, let's see if I can find some good shots of the windows. You see how each of these panels is only about 4-6 square feet at the most, but they have all these ribbings, all this ribbing in between the different actual panes of glass. And we see these arches in here, and then you can see the ribbing supporting the weight. instead of those kind of barrel vaults that would be in the Romanesque stuff. Is everybody seeing what I'm pointing out?
Yes.
Frankly, I can't unsee it. I'm remembering a bunch of places I've seen before that I was just like, oh, that looks cool. But now I was seeing there was a big purpose behind it.
Well, and now it kind of makes sense now. And I wonder, I think a lot of this is because people are coming back to Europe with, with their own worldviews, but they come back after going to the Middle East, seeing what other people have done, what other people were able to achieve. And they're just thinking about what can we do with the materials that we have. And I think that is pretty amazing. Now, this is pretty much an example of Gothic style, because even though you don't have the structural necessities or components, we still have that peaked arch, we still have the ribs, and we have this kind of stone lace, which I hope you guys can see. And even though this is carved out of ivory, it's mimicking a lot of that stuff we see in Gothic style architecture. And the windows at this time period, the first stained glass in Europe was actually made in 975 AD. So by this time, stained glass has only been around for a couple hundred years. And even though we see pictures of really large, beautiful windows, remember each pane is only going to be about 4 to 6 square feet at the most. They're small panes of glass. And the reason why they look like that is because of the ribbing in the stonework that the panes of glass like this sit into. And these are called sashes. One thing I want you to look at is how many colors of glass are used in these windows. In this window particularly. There's only 2 colors of glass in this. One is red, that's this, and the other is clear. The yellow, and there's several different shades of yellow, but the yellow glass itself is actually painted on with polymer technology called silver stain, where it looks like clay. It's painted onto the glass. The glass is fired at about 1200 degrees, and then the clay is washed off, and it leaves this silver oxide that turns yellow because of the heat. And then these black lines are all painted on with black paint. And the black paint is essentially crushed garbage glass, for lack of a better term. And notice that a lot of these pieces were cut because, and a lot of the times, like today, we can make a sheet of glass that is a typical sheet of glass that you can buy for window making is about 7 to 8 square feet. So pretty good size. But at this time, most of the time, people would make the glass by blowing either a cylinder or picking the glass up. It's called a gather on the end of a rod and spinning it on a marvering table, which is a stone table. And they'd make a lens that was maybe 8 inches around in diameter. And so you don't get really big pieces of glass. And that's one of the reasons why you see all these lines. People would cut it and piece it together the way that they could. So the person probably made this by laying all this glass out on a table, deciding where the metal would go in between the pieces that they were able to salvage from what was made, and then painting the black paint on and then the silver stain. And that's how they did that. And with the red, same kind of thing. But what is fascinating to me about this era of glasswork is these guys were really good at what they were doing. When you're working with incredibly expensive materials, you really can't afford to throw away stuff every time you screw it up. So, they did a lot of training. They did a lot of work. You would be apprenticed for years to somebody before you became a master in your own right. And they learned things like they would paint the black on one side, the silver stain on the other. After firing it, then they would turn it over and put it in. And I am seeing, just from the facial features, this reminds me an awful lot of some of those book illustrations we saw from the Carolingian stuff, as well as some of the Byzantine artwork, with the larger eyes. I don't know if you guys can see that, but I think it's interesting. So here's a model. And this thing, I think I was talking to Zach about. This shape right here is that 3-point arch where you put your compass right there, you make an arch up like that, you put your compass point right there, make an arch up like that. And it's actually two overlapping circles. Oh, no, I talked to Cassandra about this. It's actually two overlapping circles that makes almost an almond shape. Can you guys see that if I'm tracing it just like this?
Yes.
And that almond shape is used around angel images of either divine beings or saints, and it becomes something of a portal. And it becomes, I don't want to offend anybody, but this is art history. We're all grown-ups. Or, well, Zach is, anyway. But and Lindsay and Cassandra will hunt me down tomorrow and throw water balloons at me. But what this shape represents is called the vesca piscis, which is Latin for fish bladder. It is the two overlapping circles is a geometric construction that symbolizes a tree, a flower of life. It symbolizes Mary. It symbolizes the apostles, all sorts of Christian imagery. And this shape itself is symbolic of a portal. And it is also in architecture and other things, it also represents the vaginal opening. Now, that's not what it looks like, but that's what it represents. And so a lot of the times, that's why you'll have this arch and you'll have these sub arches underneath to kind of, you get this idea of this it's called a mandorla, this almond shape, this vesca piscis shape. The reason why, and you guys can see my arrow, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Early Christians, one of the things that they felt that they were a direct manifestation or a realization of one of the visions of Daniel. One of the visions of Daniel was that he said that when Christ would come, or when God would gain a body, the temple would be filled with water, and the ocean of water would fill the whole earth. So water was a very strong symbol of the Christian message being a fulfillment of the Old Testament. Who were the first apostles? Do you remember what their profession was?
Fishermen, right?
They were fish. A lot of them were fishermen. That's right. And so in the early Christian church, they used Greek to communicate, and a lot of times they scribbled on the ground. One of the things they would do is one Christian would go to an area and draw a curve like that. Did everybody see that? With my mouse? Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Yeah, what you're tracing.
Oh,
Yeah. And then the other person who was also Christian would make another curve like this. Do you guys recognize that form? So you get one curve like this, one curve like that.
It's the same shape.
Yeah, it's the same shape, and it's a fish. And one of the reasons is that one of the code words that a Christian would give to another was ichthos. And ichthos is a Greek, it's Greek for fish, but each letter represents something else in the Christian litany, which is Jesu Christo, Jesus Christ, Theohuios, which is Son of God, Sator, which is Savior. And that's why that stuff was so important. And that shape, that particular that fish shape, is actually two overlapping circles, which makes the fish bladder shape, which represents that portal opening. And one of the reasons why this ties into the vaginal opening is, does anybody know who was born in an immaculate conception, who is considered to be the queen or empress of heaven? It was Mary. And so that idea of Mary being the true path that opens the doorway for God, that is very strong, buried under a lot of the symbolism of particularly European Christianity. And that's one of the reasons why this shape is so powerful. It represents the fish. It represents an ordered universe. It represents the opening into symbolically God's presence. And it also represents a portal through which a person can access the blessings of heaven. So that is one of the reasons why Gothic arches or the openings of Gothic churches are shaped like this. Any of you believe that? What I just dished out? I guarantee at least 40% of it is true. No, but I've actually read a number of articles, and I can share a lot of that stuff with you. But from I've spent the last 40 years working on this sacred geometry type stuff, and it is really fascinating when you start looking at Christianity from the ancient Christian perspective. A lot of what the Gothic architects were doing makes a lot of sense. So definitely check out this article. More example of glass, and this shows you the other colors. The only glass colors that people really used were red, green, and blue, or versions of that, and yellow. And you get other things that are combinations of paintings. Like a lot of times they would have brown paint, or they would crush some of the glass. Like this would be crushed red, painted over the blue, different ideas like that. But they didn't use an awful lot of color. And then the yellow, of course, is the silver stain. And I love seeing these kinds of things. The Gothic sculptures of saintly people are usually at least a head taller than normal people, proportion-wise, and sometimes even taller. So that even though they're attached to the side of the building, their toes will be hanging down to make them look even taller. And part of that is a symbolism of people having the right or the encouragement to reach towards heaven, reach towards the divine, as well as to remind people that these saints are closer to the presence of God than we are, normal mortals. And this is the Hagia Sophia. Remember the tallest building in the world at the time. Definitely watch these. And I'm going to share this with you really quick. Definitely watch this video. But this shows some examples of the Gothic architecture. Remember we talked about the ribbing, the peaked arch. And do you guys remember what the peak of the arch represents, or kind of is designed to help you think of?
Trinity.
The Trinity, right. And it's a structural component that really helps to make it so you can build a much taller building without all the stone support that Roman architecture would require. And that's why you have all these crisscrossing ribbings and stuff like that. Some of these cathedrals, when I was in Europe, I started sketching these and trying to figure out the math of them, and my brain started boiling inside my head, so I quit. It is, I mean, look at this. It is astounding to me. The math that these people were able to explore doing this kind of thing. And this right here, this is about 40 feet tall. And these are images of different saints. On one panel, you're on one side of the church, you're going to have stories and saintly figures from the Old Testament. And the other side, you're going to have either more contemporary or New Testament people. And this kind of way of teaching with story, with the images in stained glass, is called typology, because specifically it's designed to help you find resolutions or learn by mirroring and find connections with similar stories that happened in the past. Because the Old Testament stories were recognized as types of contemporary time or New Testament stories. So that science is called typology. And I really like this video. Anybody's interested, this shows a lot of different ways of constructing the Gothic style arch, but you can see the 3-point triangle right here. It represents the Trinity and how they would make the arches with that. So I want to show some just examples of Gothic architecture. I really like this article because it does show a lot of this kind of stuff. And I think as we get done with it, you're going to see that there's a lot of commonalities. Now, we look at this, we got the two towers right here that makes me think of Carolingian stuff. You've got this particular peak. Remember the Roman style architecture? It's a 22.5-degree angle. This slope is the 60-degree angle, which is more Carolingian. It's that 3-point Trinity thing. But the reason we know that this is Gothic is because of these ribs that take that weight. You know, the Carolingian is still heavily influenced by Byzantine stuff. And in that case, this would have smaller buildings supporting this. But they have these ribs coming out to carry the weight of these walls and that roof, so you can have more space for stained glass windows. Now, this area right here, see how small these windows are? I mean, this is still pretty good size, but these stone ribs, in this case, in the windows, they're called traceries. And this is going to be about 18 inches to 2 feet across, even though it doesn't look like that. And then inside, they're going to have narrower ribs separating the panels. So each of the windows are only going to be about 4 to 6 square feet in surface area. And then you can see that all this kind of lacy type stuff going on here. It almost looks like the stone is being carved into lace, I think. But you can see these, where if you can imagine the rain coming down, the rain going across here and then spitting out right through here. People would catch it and drink it. I don't know why they would, because birds have been pooping on the roof in between the rainstorms, but ick. Anyway. So this is more of the Romanesque style stuff. And you can see it's pretty solid walls. There are some windows in here, but notice it's a lot of Roman style arches. And then this is going to be the Gothic type stuff, where a lot of that is replaced by the peaked arches with the ribbing. And then this is the next step, the Renaissance, where it just is this on steroids, but that's for a totally different class. Okay, we look at this. This is early Gothic, so it's still heavily influenced by Carolingian type work. And I wonder if that kind of informs the two towers kind of thing, but you can still see this feels a little bit more of that Roman style construction that we saw up here. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed it. Right here. It still feels like it's heavily influenced by that. But as we move more towards the height of the Gothic, that's when you start seeing a lot of this stone lacy type stuff. That's where you start seeing this mandorla. And we can call it a vescopiscus or a mandorla. Either way, either of those terms make you sound super smart. And then these are also called rose windows. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is rose is a flower, of course, and this looks like a petaled flower. But the rose was also a symbol. Have you guys ever heard of the hierarchy of forms?
No.
Yes.
Okay, the hierarchy of forms is something that it's originated with Plato, and the whole allegory of the cave and talking about the realm of the ideal kind of was its genesis. But the hierarchy of forms was to communicate things, tell stories, and kind of allow for a system that everybody could share as they were decorating and designing. The hierarchy of forms is for every form, for every column of life or development, there is a sequence of high or most valuable to low or least valuable. So for like metals, the high would be gold, the low would be lead. For trees, the high would be oak, and the low would be whatever kind of crappy tree grows and gets in everybody's way, like a weed. For flowers, what do you think the high of the flower is?
rose.
You're absolutely right. And what you'll see is a lot of medieval decoration going up through the Victorian era, people will use oak leaves. They'll use uh, roses growing on vines to kind of illustrate these ideas. And they'll mix in some other flowers. Like in the Americas, the columbine was used quite a bit. So the rose represents things like God or Jesus or wisdom. The columbine will represent things like covenants, the sacred feminine. Um, the five petal flower will represent things like that, and it's or the five petaled columbine will represent things like that. And what's interesting to me is you can usually tell these windows are going to be in the area that lets the most light in, and it's really fascinating when you look at uh, the the floor plan of a lot of these cathedrals. It looks like a cross laid out on the ground, and when people come into church, they're usually facing where the sun is coming in from the far side, so the sun is bursting out through here, and it feels like they're coming in to a path doorway into heaven. And it's just really fascinating stuff. But these are called rose windows because they connect with God, they connect with the divine, they connect with wisdom.
Why
And
do you
and
think we
they're round, many petaled flowers. Anyway,
why do
blah
you
blah
think we
blah.
stop making
What's that?
buildings? Why do you think we stop making buildings like that?
Um, Economy is a big reason. These were expensive because it would take teams of contractors working in the feudal system of basically indentured servant, journeyman, and master, and it would take maybe 2 or 3 generations to build one of these. They could be designed, and it may take them anywhere from 40 to 100 years to build one. And as people started moving in towards quicker modes of construction, where it became the economy was more investing in materials to build rather than investing into people's lives, then a lot of this kind of stuff, there was no reason to do a lot of this stuff because you look at some of these traceries, like this may take 30 years just to build the stonework for this. And in that time, you have an indentured servant who is able to become a journeyman, who's then become a master to train other indentured servants and journeymen. And you may have that going as a cycle for 2 or 3 times. But if you have a workshop that can churn these out and make one of these every 5 years, it becomes a lot less expensive for the people building the buildings, and it becomes a lot more cost effective to move away from that journeyman and master guild hall way of doing things. And I think that's one reason. And then also, as you get more and stronger materials, architectural styles are going to change to take advantage of the different materials too. Are you guys starting to get a feeling for this kind of Gothic architecture? We get it almost feels to me almost like it's being lace being chiseled out of the stone. And
Yeah.
I like this next to each other. We get the Romanesque style, and then you get the Gothic style. And you get, this kind of echo of battlements from the Crusades, and this is definitely an echo of the very classic Roman style architecture. And here we have the peaks, we have the fanciful stonework, these 40-foot tall columns of stained glass, just amazing stuff. Excuse me. Okay, and this is another article that shows more examples of brilliant Gothic engineering and construction, Gothic architecture. And we don't always have these 60-degree triangles. And a lot of times we do have these Roman style round arches. But are you guys seeing enough of a consistency where you see the lace and you see the ribbing supporting the weight and the stained glass and all those kinds of things? Are you guys seeing that?
Yes.
Definitely.
Then we also got
I thought the Rijksmuseum was Gothic in the Netherlands because of the huge stained glass, but now looking at these Gothic buildings, it's not near fancy enough. So I think it would be more Romanesque. Sorry.
This is what you're talking about, the Rijksmuseum? Yeah, that it looks to me like this may have been influenced by Gothic type stuff because of some of the shapes. But I can see it. It looks like it has a lot more of those Roman style arches on it than the Gothic type peaked arches, doesn't it?
When you're inside it, because of all the stained glass, I was like, oh, this must be a Gothic style building. Yeah, those are the same as the ones you showed us earlier, but that has like Plato, Michelangelo. It doesn't have church people. So these are more artists in those stained glass. But the inside was super fancy. So I guess, but these don't have the pointed arch. They're all rounded arches on it.
And looking at this right through here, you can see the flowers and some of the leaves and stuff. This comes right out of that hierarchy of forms, too. But I think it's interesting because this seems to be, instead of that biblical typology, this seems to be, like you said, more artists and scholars and um, philosophers. Where if this was a true Gothic style construction, there'd probably be biblical figures and saints in here instead of Plato and Michelangelo. I think you're right.
I thought I knew when I was there, but I guess I just learned that I had no idea.
I don't want to go through this whole thing, but I'm thinking you guys are starting to see what's going on, or you guys definitely see what's going on. You know, the like the big giveaway for this is these ribs right here that tell us that this is Gothic, and this right here, this big round window. I think that's pretty amazing. Like right here, these replace those piers that we saw supporting the roof of the Hagia Sophia in Turkey, and these become those flying buttress type things because the weight is separated out and away from the building so that they can have room for the windows. Oh, here's a really good example of those flying buttress kinds of things. The reason they're called flying buttresses is because they do go through the air instead of stay right close to the building. When I think of Gothic, the first thing that comes to my mind is things like Corpse Bride and Addams Family. And this church, I think, is right in there.
Or Game of Thrones.
Yeah. Yeah. Where it's the term of Gothic that is uh, dark and hopeless, almost nihilistic. And that's not what it originally meant. The Gothic, I think, ties into an assumption that people made when they looked at it, that it came from Germany, and that the name just stuck and then stayed with it. This one is interesting to me because this looks a lot more like late Gothic, early Renaissance to me.
Or a mosque.
Yeah, these are pretty amazing things. Okay, we're going to go back and look at some of the Gothic arts. Now, the paintings, I think, are really fascinating because people are always aware of what it means to be realistic. Remember that one of the things we talk about through this whole class is that people paint the way that they do because that is what is needed symbolically for their society. So for the Egyptians, you'll have photorealism in one part, but when it's spiritual stuff having to do with the Book of the Dead or anything like that, it's very stylized. And a lot of the times you'll see that same kind of thing in a lot of different styles. And it's interesting to me that the Gothic period of painting seems to be where they are right on the cusp of valuing the human form as in realistic depictions. And I think that's really fascinating because here I think you see some of the stuff going on, like the way that the angels are really tall and everything that reminds me of some of the stuff we saw with the Byzantine stuff. And then you get this where it feels like somebody's trying really hard to make this look like a real human being. And it's not because they couldn't before, but it's because this is when it starts becoming important. And you see the halos, we talked about the halos. You know, the heavenly beings, the beings connected strongly to heaven are going to have halos. And then Jesus is going to be marked out because this halo will have signifiers of the cross. And the globe he's holding also symbolizes the world.
If you're showing an image, we can't really see it because it is still locked on the canvas page.
Okay, how's this?
There we go.
Okay, thank you for saying something, Cassandra. Okay. All right. This is what I'm looking at right here, where the angels have bodies that remind me quite a bit of those Byzantine mosaics. Tall bodies, and they just kind of look like flowy figures. But what I'm talking about is it looks to me like it's becoming important to show human-like features, so that it does look relatively realistic. And what I was talking about, the halos, all the beings linked to heaven have these golden halos, and then Jesus's have these marks which remind you of the cross. So you can kind of see there's missing one that's right behind his throat right there. You can see that, right?
Yes.
Okay. And when we look at this, why aren't the mountains more naturalistic? Why isn't this structurally plausible? Why are these things different? Well, it's because it's not important that the mountains look naturalistic. It's important that you realize this is a mountain. And it's not important that this looks like a historically accurate depiction of the opening of a tomb. It is important that you recognize symbolically that this is the tomb. And of course, this is the raising of Lazarus. And we have relatively naturalistic faces. And still, the bodies are a little bit taller, like we saw with the Byzantines. Here's Lazarus's mama and Jesus. And we could tell Jesus because of his halo, little hints at stuff going on behind there. I don't see the cross in this halo. That's not important. We see his long hair and beard, which are also indicators of Jesus. And he's the only one who's beckoning at Lazarus to come out. This guy is covering his nose because he says that he's saying that Lazarus is stinking because he's dead. Now this is really an interesting one to me too. This depicts St. Peter being rescued by an angel. Why, even though this happened in the 1st century AD, why are these guys wearing contemporary European clothes? And why is this guy wearing with contemporary European armor and armaments? Anybody want to hazard a guess?
Is it that same thing to just convey what the story is rather than the accuracy of it?
Yeah, it's this idea of a typology again, where you're comparing an ancient story to you. This is not typology. I'm saying it's a similar kind of idea. A lot of the times they would use contemporary costumes, even though everybody knew this is not what a Roman soldier would wear. They would use contemporary costumes so that you would be invited to either to at the same time put yourself in the story as an observer and then also compare it to your own life. You know, if an angel is able to do that for Peter, what can an angel potentially do for me? You know, if I have the faith, could God save me from my own problems? Those kinds of things. And the contemporary imagery is designed to help the viewer connect that with, you know, their current outlook. Now, this you can kind of see that they are going a little bit towards realism, but still, I see a lot of that Byzantine style face. And here in the baby Jesus, you have the cross in the halo. So definitely go through and check out. I don't know why this ad showed up. Sorry. Definitely go through and check this out. Now, one of the reasons why you do see Jesus, even though they knew how to make babies look like babies, Jesus is shown as a perfectly proportioned angry little old man because of the belief that the doctrinal belief that Jesus was conceived with all the realized potential that he had as an adult, all the knowledge and everything else, because that logically follows if you assume that Jesus, as a perfected being, would contain all the perfection of his entire life at every moment in his life. I don't think that's what perfection means, but I'm not the one who signed off on this doctrine, so I'm not going to comment about it. And you know, and these paintings I think are pretty fantastic. And then remember that, and here's some more examples of Gothic art, Gothic sculptures, paintings, stained glass. A lot of this stuff feels to me like it is heavily informed by Greek and Roman aesthetics, but I see something like this and I'm thinking maybe they knew about the Etruscans too. You get this little dimple right there on either side of the smile. That looks very Etruscan to me. Now, the Carolingian Charlemagne was the one that came up with basically the typeface for everybody to paint in when they were writing. And you do see that this is pretty consistent, but at this time period, you also have a lot of individuality. So they do stray away from the font styles that Charlemagne developed. And people start showing up with more flourishes, and you start getting what becomes later cursive. Pretty impressive stuff, I think, overall. And this video, I definitely recommend. This talks about some of the medieval women artists. Up and before the Renaissance, it wasn't really important for an artist to be recognized for their work or their studio. When you start getting into the Renaissance, that's when people start creating cults of personality, and that's when artists are identified with specific studios. Like, for example, Michelangelo had a studio where at one time he was hiring almost 36 people working for him. He would design stuff and he would do the final touches. And then the 30 people that worked under him would do everything else. But people make contracts where Michelangelo would have to work on X number of square inches or X number of hours on the piece, and his studio would do the rest of that, which you guys probably didn't know. But before that time, in the contracts that people made, it was to produce things, and the individual artists were not as important. Now, the master of a studio or the master of a guild, that would be important. And whether or not that master worked on it, you could put that into the contract. But the individual artist, it was considered that once you went through the guild program and you were a journeyman or a master, you had the same qualifications as all the other journeymen and masters. So we have red, green, and blue. We have a little bit of red stain on this glass to kind of turn it purple. And the yellow comes from silver stain for the most part. What is interesting to me is knowing that those are the three principal colors of glass, red, green, and blue. You guys remember what the three principal colors of the white light is? What are the three primary colors of light? It's red, green, and blue. And in Christian iconography, red represents the color of sacrifice or Christ's blood. Green represents the Holy Spirit. And blue represents heaven or God the Father. Yellow represents wisdom. Pretty interesting stuff. I think that these, when you start looking at later windows, like right here, we're looking at late Gothic and early Renaissance. Right here, these are very much different than if we look at the early Gothic stuff. That's a couple hundred years earlier. These people seem to be heavily informed by the Carolingian style figure painting and Byzantine figures. And these look like there's a much bigger emphasis placed on shared realism. So, and you look at the dates, you can tell this is 300 years later. Isn't it interesting? I think it is. Anyway, that's pretty much what I wanted to talk. Does anybody have any questions or observations about that kind of stuff that we saw?
I wish that the painting of the panels, like the Giotto that you just showed, what came sooner. Like it just starts happening when our class finalizes, I guess, and dates.
Well, and sometimes it can be a little bit frustrating. Like I wish we had a couple weeks just to go over Cahokia. I think that'd be pretty awesome, and the Oceania. And sometimes it seems like you look at some of this stuff and you think, oh yeah, that's fantastic. We just don't have the time to really dive into it. So yeah, it is a little bit frustrating.
That you showed us today was really cool. I appreciate you showing us all that Gothic stuff and explaining it to us.
Like thank you, Zach. I just dawned on me, I am not going to be able to show you guys all the AI stuff I wanted to, as we are almost out of time. I am really sorry. That was bad planning on my part. And I want to.
If you do want to show it, I do have Theosuit as well, but you could record it as a separate video and then have that also for viewing for if people wanted to look at it. Unless it's a small amount and we can go through
That's a really
those.
good idea, because I told you my computer died and I wanted to show people stuff. What I will do then is I'll record another video, probably like tonight or tomorrow, and put that online so that you guys can watch it as extra credit for what's it, attendance. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Good to me.
Because there's some really cool stuff that people did. Like this person, 5 stuff. Jody did 5 things from looks like Roman type sculptures, and then they used AI to generate something new and evaluated it, and then did a second version.
That's what I say. I think we saw this one before.
Yeah, we saw that one before. But I'm thinking it might be good just to go through and do a video where I talk about all of them. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, that or just having the ones that you were going to show that were like new but couldn't as like another video for us to watch if we wanted to.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that sounds good. I think I'll do that. Okay, great. Let's plan on that then. And I will put that together as soon as I can, which may be, tomorrow or Thursday. I was going to do something like that last week, but I got caught up in all the junk that you get caught up in when various family comes over. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for being on this journey with me this semester. I I I am really impressed with what people are doing with AI. I'm really impressed with what people have done with projects. And I want to remind everybody you can turn stuff in. I just got confirmation that Canvas is open until the 12th, midnight of the 12th. So you guys can still turn in your stuff through the 12th. And I people have been really good about letting me know if things are going to be late and whatnot, and I appreciate that. But I think that that's what we will do is if you don't have access to something and it doesn't allow you to turn something in before the 12th, let me know and we'll figure out a workaround. But everybody go back. If you're missing some points on assignment, check all your assignments. If you don't have a perfect score, find out why. And I've been pretty good. I've only had a couple of people that I've graded the wrong thing when I gave them their points, and understandably, they were confused and a little bit upset. And I appreciate everybody's patience as I resolving those issues. So please continue, and I will. I have not graded. I've graded all the AI stuff that's been turned in. I've not graded the final projects. I will work on that over the next day or two. And then anybody if you don't have all the points, you have until the 12th to revisit that and turn it in. And remember that next week, starting Sunday at midnight, the final will be open, and it behooves you to get that done as soon as you possibly can at the beginning of finals week. Because then when you turn it in, if you don't score all the points you want, you have the rest of finals week to revisit it and resubmit it. All right. Anybody have any last questions or anything before we wrap this up?
Nope. Thank you for your time.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I love seeing what you guys come up with. And what is particularly astounding to me is the people that claim, oh, I'm not an artist, they'll turn around and do fantastic things with the tools that they have. So I'm very happy with what I'm seeing. And if anybody, either here tonight or watching this later, if you need help or anything like that, reach out to me with any concerns or questions that you have, and I will do whatever I can to help you. All right. So we'll see you guys. You have a good night and stay healthy and well.
You too. Have a great night.